although the turret fighter Defiant prototype was already being built in 1936 before it had even won the production contract, the Air Ministry was already looking for its replacement. Military leaders were convinced that the new all-metal bombers had become too hard to bring down. Their airframes could easily shrug off firing passes from the fighters of the day, armed with nothing more than rifle-caliber machine guns. The thinking was that reliably destroying these targets required more firepower, the kind only cannons could deliver. The earlier specs called for an aircraft with 4 .30-caliber machine guns mounted in a powered turret. But the next generation of turret fighters was supposed to be far more lethal, carrying 4 20mm cannons in the same kind of rotating turret. In March 1936, the military drew up a new specification. They wanted a twin-engine, 3-seat aircraft armed with 4 cannons capable of reaching 375 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. But these requirements kept shifting. Manufacturers and engineers argued back and forth over whether the aviation industry could even build something like that with the engines and technology available at the time. There were also heated debates about how to arm the new aircraft. First, they scrapped the idea of dropping a 250-pound high-explosive bomb on enemy bombers. Then they rejected Hugh Dowding's proposal for heavier cannons. The whole idea of putting all the weapons in the turret also came into question, so designers proposed all kinds of combinations: guns in the nose, the wings, the turret. Speed requirements changed several times, but they finally settled on 370 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. The government officially asked aircraft manufacturers to submit their designs in March 1937. Boulton Paul jumped on these new requirements right away. They were worried that orders for the P-82 might simply be canceled in favor of larger aircraft. Back in Norwich, work on the P-82 prototype was moving along nicely, but the upcoming move to Wolverhampton would mean delays. So the company took on a new project called the P-92. They designed it around the updated government specs from late May 1937. The military wanted a 3-seat fighter for day and night operations, armed with 4 20mm Hispano cannons. They'd be mounted in a powered turret that could rotate a full 360 degrees. The turret needed to fire in any direction, including straight ahead with wide angles of fire both up and down. The gunner's station rotated with the turret, and he had a completely clear view overhead. The pilot's cockpit also needed excellent visibility. Absolutely critical for night flying, the aircraft's top speed had to be at least 370 miles per hour at 35,000 feet. At cruise, it needed to make at least 320 miles per hour at the same altitude. They expected it to be highly maneuverable and easy to handle at low speeds and rock-solid stable when the guns were firing. Even with one engine out, the fighter had to hold altitude comfortably at 15,000 feet. The crew also needed comfortable, adjustable seats and rudder pedals, plus a well-designed emergency escape system. Engine swaps had to be doable in 2 hours. To keep production safe from bombing, the aircraft had to be built in sections that could be put together at different factories. Besides Boulton Paul, 5 other well-known aviation companies competed for the contract: Armstrong Whitworth, Bristol, Hawker, Short, and Supermarine. In early 1938, the designers got a curveball. The government suddenly came out with even tougher performance demands for the future aircraft. But it quickly became clear that those numbers were simply unachievable, so they had to drop the sky-high demands. By March, the Air Ministry had ordered 3 P-92 prototypes. The first one would get Rolls-Royce Vulture engines, the second Napier Sabres. The third prototype also got Vulture engines, but its primary job was testing the gun turret and armament. By late May of that same year, the Boulton Paul mock-up was ready for its first lookover. It was a large 3-seat monoplane with a high-mounted wing and stressed skin construction. The gun turret was tucked almost entirely inside the massive center section of the wing. This rotating dome measured 13 feet across. It housed 4 powerful 20mm Hispano cannons recessed into bays that sat flush with the skin. When the guns weren't in use, the openings were automatically sealed by fairings to keep things streamlined. The initial design included 2 additional 303 machine guns flanking the cannons. But the designers eventually decided this needlessly complicated things and dropped the idea entirely. Behind the cannons, slightly off-center in the turret, sat a small glazed compartment for the gunner. Since nearly the entire weapon system was hidden inside the wing, only the top of the dome stuck out above the surface. It was given the smoothest, most streamlined shape possible. The engineers understood that the enormous ball-bearing ring could seize up if the airframe flexed during flight, so they heavily reinforced the structure between the spars to make it more rigid and added an extra outer ring. The turret itself was a metal framework skinned in light alloy. Like other Boulton Paul designs, it was driven by an electro-hydraulic system. The gunner sat right between the breech blocks of two pairs of cannons which were mounted on special shock absorbers. The Hispanos were drum-fed, and the gunner had to reload them himself. To save him from hauling heavy replacement drums, the engineers mounted the drums on rails under the turret roof. In combat, all you had to do was slide a drum forward, right up to the gun. Each barrel carried 120 rounds. The clear dome on top measured 3.2 feet across and could be easily jettisoned in an emergency. It was made from a single piece of perspex and was attached to the rotating ring along with the gun sight. And to prevent the gunner from accidentally shooting off a piece of his own aircraft in the heat of battle, they fitted an interrupter gear that blocked the guns automatically. The broad wing, spanning 66 feet 3 inches, had a distinctive inverted gull shape. Its massive center section swept down to the engine nacelles, while the outer panels angled noticeably upward. The wing was fitted with split flaps and freeze ailerons. Viewed head-on, the combination of this wing shape and the low-slung turret gave the aircraft a slightly hunched look, a distinctive silhouette. The first and third prototypes would get two Rolls-Royce Vulture II engines rated at 1,760 horsepower each. These drove massive 13-foot propellers. The engine nacelles were mounted under the wings, and the main landing gear retracted into them as well. Radiators sat at the front of the nacelles, along with fire suppression and de-icing systems. The second prototype, meanwhile, was slated for the even more powerful 24-cylinder Napier Sabre 1 engines, putting out 2,180 horsepower. The fuselage was built in 5 sections: nose, center, 2 rear sections, and tail. Because the gun turret was hidden inside the thick center wing section, the fuselage itself could be made very narrow and streamlined. The pilot's cockpit was pushed far forward, ahead of the propeller arc, giving him a perfect view in front. Since the blades spun so close, the cockpit had to be heavily soundproofed. But having the props that close created another problem. While the pilot could technically pop the canopy and bail out the conventional way, the risk of hitting the blades was too great. So the engineers came up with a safer escape method. The seat tilted back 110 degrees, and the pilot could slide out feet first through a hatch in the belly of the fuselage. Designer John North personally tested this trick on the mock-up, though he ended up with some minor head injuries in the process. Right behind the pilot sat the navigator, whose compartment was also carefully soundproofed. His station was set up for long missions. On internal fuel, the aircraft could stay airborne for an hour and a half, including 15 minutes at full power at low altitude. It carried 328 gallons normally, but with drop tanks, the range jumped to an impressive 2,000 miles. Boulton Paul's engineers claimed their new aircraft, weighing in at 19,000 pounds total, would be a real performer in the air. On paper, it would do 371 miles per hour, competitive with the fastest fighters of the era. At 30,000 feet, it would hold 353 miles per hour with a ceiling of 38,000 feet. They started building the first 2 prototypes in mid-1939, and at the same time, a big push on aerodynamic research for the P-92 was in full swing. Since the company's own wind tunnel was too small, a scale model with a 17-foot, 10-inch wingspan was tested in the giant 24-foot tunnel at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. These tests ran from March through September 1939. To simulate propeller effects as accurately as possible, the model was even fitted with 2 small 15-horsepower engines. Meanwhile, in a smaller tunnel, engineers carefully studied how the gun turret affected drag, what happened when the guns moved, and how well the tail surfaces worked. The test turned up a serious problem. When the guns were elevated to 45 degrees and traversed to 135 degrees, drag increased by a whopping 35%. On top of that, lift dropped by a quarter at maximum speed. To dig deeper into these aerodynamic issues and find solutions, the developers tried something unconventional. They built a half-scale wooden replica of the aircraft that could actually fly. It was powered by two de Havilland Gypsy major engines, each producing 130 horsepower. Since Boulton Paul didn't have the gear to build wooden aircraft and was completely tied up with Defiant production, the contract went to Heston Aircraft. The original designers called it P-92, while the new contractors knew it as JA-8. The P-92 model was built entirely of wood. The fuselage, wings, and nearly all control surfaces were skinned in plywood. Only the rudder was fabric covered. They only used metal for the engine cowlings, nose section, and landing gear. The gear itself was fixed, by the way, to keep the design as simple as possible. Instead of a real gun turret, they installed a plywood fairing to simulate it, though they never actually mounted dummy gun barrels. The engineers made sure the Gypsy engine nacelles matched the proportions of the full-size aircraft exactly. Because of this, cooling air had to come in through channels running from the landing gear fairings. Building this scaled-down replica ran into some unexpected headaches. For instance, it turned out to be incredibly difficult to find a pilot short enough to fit. So the forward fuselage had to be widened to fit a normal-sized pilot. The challenges kept coming. Engineers struggled to fit structural spars into the tiny components at the wingtips, and finding any space at all for a camera and instrument panel was a real puzzle. On top of everything, extra holes had to be cut in the fuselage, which seriously weakened the all-wood structure. Getting out of this aircraft in an emergency was even harder than in the full-size version. The escape panel sat behind the pilot's seat on the port side. Pull a handle, and the seat would tip backward, the panels would slide apart, and the pilot had to literally crawl to the exit, squirming on his back and side. The cramped cockpit and the bulky parachute strapped to his back made all of this incredibly difficult. But that was just the theory. In practice, the pilot sat practically on the floor of a long, narrow cockpit. Getting out this way was nearly impossible for one absurd reason. The pilot simply couldn't reach the escape handle from his seat. When the P-92 Mark II was finally delivered to the Royal Air Force's experimental establishment, someone tied a simple rope to that handle, just to put the test pilots' minds at ease. Still, most pilots figured it was safer to just jettison the canopy and jump with a parachute, even with the enormous risk of hitting the propeller blades. And getting into the cockpit was actually harder than getting out. Plus, it was impossible to do while the engines were running. The canopy was a single piece, and it could only be removed with help from outside. Only then could the pilot carefully squeeze between the nacelle and the fuselage to reach his seat. The wing was fitted with 3-section flaps running from the fuselage all the way to the ailerons. Because the designers were concerned about the sharp taper of the wing, they installed leading-edge slats near the wingtips. However, as later testing showed, these worries turned out to be unnecessary. Another safety measure was an anti-spin parachute tucked away in the tail. Even before the P-92 Mark II was finished, the need for it had evaporated. On May 26, 1940, the entire P-92 project was simply canceled. They'd already cut the metal for the two prototypes, and the airframe was about 5% done, but the Air Ministry decided to focus resources on fewer aircraft types. Among them was the Bristol Beaufighter, already rolling off the production line, along with 4 other prototypes that were already flying. Still, they decided to finish the experimental P-92 Mark II. It first flew in the spring of 1941 at Heston Airfield with Flight Lieutenant Cecil Feather at the controls. After several test flights, the aircraft was ferried to Wolverhampton. There, a new round of testing began. The engineers wanted to see how the massive turret affected the aircraft's aerodynamics. They attached dummy gun barrels to the center wing section and the turret itself, along with pressure-sensing tubes. In June 1943, the P-92 Mark II went to the test center at Boscombe Down, where test pilots spent the next month putting it through its paces. The local test pilots weren't even told that the strange dome-shaped bump on the fuselage was meant to simulate a gun turret. The pilots assumed it would house a radar antenna. According to the pilots, the cockpit was very cramped and stuffy on the ground, but in flight it got plenty of cool air. The propellers were spinning right next to them, but pilots didn't complain about noise. In a full-size combat aircraft, the cockpit racket would have been unbearable. Visibility to the sides and rear was poor, but for a combat aircraft with a tail gunner, that didn't really matter. Forward visibility, on the other hand, was excellent. The pilot had a clear, unobstructed view spanning 85 degrees. But because of this design, while taxiing, the pilot of this single-seat prototype had to constantly weave from side to side just to see what was behind him. This aircraft turned out to be a real pleasure to fly, nearly free of vices. It held heading and altitude beautifully, though controlling roll and turbulence was uncomfortable. The ailerons and rudder worked fine, but the elevator didn't have enough up travel. During descents and landings, pilots had to keep hauling the nose up. The problem was that lowering the flaps upset the balance, and the aircraft kept trying to nose over sharply. It only stalled at very low speeds, and recovery was quick regardless of whether the engines were running or not. Flying on one engine wasn't a problem. The pilot could freely turn toward either the live engine or the dead one. In dives, the aircraft behaved steadily whether the engines were at full power or throttled back to a third. Pulling out of steep dives didn't take much effort. Because of limited trim authority, the approach had to be flown at a fairly high speed. At 70 miles per hour, the aircraft descended steeply, and the glide path was too flat. However, the large flap area helped steepen the descent angle to something more familiar for pilots. The elevator was effective enough to grease a three-point landing. Testing showed that the P-92 Mark II's drag was higher than wind tunnel tests had predicted. However, British researchers believe that when the full-size aircraft was built, its real-world performance would come much closer to the predicted numbers than this prototype's did. On July 4, 1941, they ordered a half-scale mock turret for the P-92. It was supposed to rotate using either electric or hydraulic power. The developers promised to deliver in 5 to 6 months. But the test establishment's leadership was skeptical. They figured it would take at least that long again to iron out the bugs. In their view, spending several £1,000s on these studies was simply pointless. That hardline stance killed development of the turret mechanism entirely. After testing wrapped up, the prototype went back to the company. It was kept around for a while, but eventually it was simply scrapped. Still, the tests had shown that the P-92 could have become a capable night fighter. Its only real weakness would have been the Vulture engines. When the P-92 project was finally put to rest, Boulton Paul's engineers had to accept that the Defiant was their last production aircraft. It wasn't until after World War II ended that a new Boulton Paul design finally took to the skies. Only a handful of turret fighters actually saw service during World War II. Not counting the Blenheim, the only one not built by Boulton Paul was the American Northrop P-61 Black Widow, and it could do just about everything the P-92 was supposed to. It grew out of combat reports the British shared in 1940 about the Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign, which made clear that the military needed a dedicated night fighter, one with radar, heavy armament, and long endurance. When the P-61 entered service in 1944, it was a 3-seat night fighter. Its gross weight reached 27,600 pounds, heavier than the P-92. But that extra weight was more than made up for by its two Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines, each producing 2,000 horsepower. As a result, the aircraft's performance lined up almost perfectly with what had been projected for the P-92. The P-61's top speed was 369 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. It could climb to 33,100 feet, and with external tanks, it could cover 1,900 miles. Its large remotely operated turret carried 4 50 caliber machine guns, a different approach from the P-92's cannon-armed turret. Unlike the P-92, it could also fire straight ahead from 4 fixed 20mm cannons. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow also carried radar, a system the P-92 would have inevitably ended up with as well. The troublesome Vulture, or even the Sabre, engines would have seriously slowed down the P-92's development. But if the aircraft had been given reliable engines and its turret problems had been worked out, it could have become a capable night fighter and ground attack aircraft, performing right on par with the Black Widow.